Hi, Misha here, and continuing to look at the various Federation Starfleet ships from Star Trek Discovery using the Eagle-Moss. Well, they are the standard collection, although they're not the small size of the original series. They're the intermediate. Anyway, I'm not sure when I'll publish all these videos, but I'm recording them during my ATF inspection audit, which is fine so far, but these are my stress relievers, so those of you that have decided to hang out with me, thanks, because these are really helping me keep from going insane and worrying overly much. So, with that, let's talk about two flat ships. These are both kind of secondary ships, background ships. They were always kind of meant as such. We have here the USS Toplana Hath, named after the Vulcan philosopher and the first ship to make contact with a somewhat drunken Zefram Cochrane. Maybe they were actually interstellar police because he'd been flying a spaceship under the influence. Maybe that's the scene after first contact, him getting a breathalyzer and, okay, yeah, like I said, I'm under some stress right now. Anyway, this is an interesting design, kind of an older type of ship. And then we have a kind of fellow one here. This is the USS Shren, named after Jeffrey Combs. I would say the Andorian, but let's just be honest. Combs, by this point, just needs a ship named after him. And we also see a couple of sister ships of these throughout Discovery. So let's talk about them and then compare. Because, honestly, at first, these may not seem like they fit, at least in the general sense. I don't mean details, but, the whole flat with nacelles mashed to the saucer. That might seem atypical, weird for Star Trek, but the truth is, it's really not. But we'll get to that. So, the Toplana goes onto the spinny thing. This is an Engle-Class ship, named after a NASA test pilot who actually flew the shuttle, shuttle Enterprise. Even though it never went to space, the shuttle definitely had lots of test flights, gliding down and whatnot. And later he would go to space on the Columbia. So that's kind of neat. I always have had a thing for astronauts and the space program. It's just the era I grew up in. Those were kind of our heroes. But we see this. We also see the USS Earhart, named after, of course, Amelia Earhart. And I also learned that my TTS program, text-to-speech program, doesn't know how to say Earhart. It says Earhart, which just cracks me up every time. So if I say Earhart in this video, that's why. But those were both at the Battle of the Binary Stars, and we know at least the Shran here, the Toplana Hath here, did not make it. It's a very flat design, very flattened out nacelles, typical two-pronged Discovery deflector, pretty typical bridge. This is not a small ship. It in the Eagle-Moss magazine, they claim it to be about 388 meters. Doing my 2/3 rule, that still kind of gets us to about 258, meaning a little bit shorter than a Connie, a little longer than a Miranda. But since it's so compacted in, that really does mean there's going to be a decent amount of habitable space. And I'm starting to get a theory. It could be wrong. But this has a registry of NCC 1004. The Earhart, a little bit higher than that. I think it's like 1020 something. Discovery has 1031. The Glenn had 1030. I'm starting to think maybe the 1000s were reserved for experimental ships or exploration type ships. Because if you start to look at these, when you group them by 1000 or 1200 or 1400 or 1600 to 1700, they have similarities. for example, the 14s seem to be science ships. If you look at the 1600s, they seem to be a little more battle-oriented. And then, of course, the 17s would be your Constitutions, which really, literally are a class in and of themselves. But we don't, of course, have a lot of data on this ship because it's just a background ship that just appears in Season 1 from Discovery. But still, we can have fun with it. Here we are from the top. Pretty typical plan. We have what appears to be a saucer front, and then it comes to a blocky rear section. Again, very thin nacelles. Flipping it over, we have a bit of a step down here and a bit of a flat underside. Keeping in mind this is quite long, a lot of that is the main hull. Yeah, there could be quite a bit going on, so I think this would have plenty of habitable space. And that's just about all we know about it. I like it has the two connection struts on each side. It's very square, like everything's very square. Even the rounded saucer as such is kind of subdued and flattened out because of the deflector in the front. John Eaves credits the NX as an influence on this. I understand that, but I think there's better connections to be made with the way they did it. Certainly not a ship that would be mistaken for much else. But let's move on. The Uss Shren. This is a Magee-Class, and that's named after a Canadian pilot and poet. And it's said to be a science research survey type ship. And while the Engle-Class is quite long, this is quite short, even in Discovery. Even officially the length is only 225 meters. Scaling that down, that gets us just over 150, which is not really problematic. We see lots of Starfleet ships in that mid-hundreds meter range before and after this. And we actually know a little bit more about this ship because while the Shran here was lost at the Binary Stars, a sister ship, the USS Cabot, was featured in The Trouble with Edward. And we know a little bit more. We see a few interiors, and we learn a few things, like it being a science ship, and then it has at least half a dozen decks, which, considering its relatively small size, is probably about all there's room for. Now, obviously, it has very Discovery-esque flat nacelles, and based on how thick and bulbous they are, kind of gives you an idea of how small it is. One thing I will point out, for as abnormal as the nacelle placement is, the saucer section and edge is very TOS-y, or at least TMP. It has the way it comes down, the shapes and everything. Very much reminds me of it. Yep, yet another love it or hate it type ship, I'm sure. And off the stand. This is physically one of the smallest models we have, but it's relatively thick for its size, so it's pretty heavy. It does have these kind of grills in the back of the nacelles. It's kind of nice. Don't know how well-defined of a deflector it has. In the past, a lot of Star Trek ships have kind of been a little iffy on the deflector, but one good thing about the Discovery ships we've had, they mostly have remembered to put a deflector in. Not sure. I'm sure it's technically someplace on this one. Maybe this. I guess it has to be that. Surprised it's not here. Well, background ship. Yeah, I get it. Love it or hate it. Because of its small size, the bridge is quite prominent. So, yeah. My question is, how do you get around the nacelle? Well, I guess they do kind of plump up in the front, so I guess you would kind of cross over and under them. Yeah, I'm not sure how you'd move around. But, as we're about to see, getting around nacelles and things is not a new problem in Star Trek with this ship. It's very much an old problem. So let's start comparing and seeing where these kind of fit in the fleet. Now, obviously, going back in time, the NX really influences all the Discovery ships. But let's look at the Warp Delta. I think when this first came out, people really didn't know what to think of it, but it seems to have grown to become a fan favorite, at least very recognizable. I like it. With the bridge towards the front of the angled section, this is where kind of a modern-esque space shuttle starts to bleed into what a future starship could be. Very reminiscent of the Buran with the thing in front. And, yeah, obviously the nacelles are on pylons and stretched out a bit, but if you compacted them in and rounded things out, I think you can see a connection to the Engle-Class here for sure. I don't know. I definitely see it. Well, as much as I see anything. And while we're at it, let's compare to the other kind of major secondary ship from Enterprise, the Intrepid class, the half saucer. The reason I decided to bring this out is it does start to blend the nacelles in with the saucer sticking out. Now they're not integrated like the Shran over here, but the placement is actually quite similar, including the shape with the kind of round front and everything. If you just lowered these down and mushed them into the hull, if nothing else, it shows you that Star Trek has been happy to have some awkward, out-of-the-box, let's say, designs. This one is so kind of clunky and ugly that it's cool. And it's a good bridge between the Delta and the eventual NX. Now, in the real world, this was a kit bash of an NX using CGI. But this to me seems like a progenitor of the Magee, both in terms of scale and class and all this, because this was not a very big ship. So what do you think? With that, let's move to the 23rd century. We do have a very obvious connection, but first, this. Okay, I'm cheating a little bit here. This is the transport that carried the Medusan ambassador in the TOS, or to be exact, TOS remastered, because the original TOS essentially used balls of light for ships, or just didn't. But this is acknowledged to be, if not a Starfleet, at least a Federation design, and it's obviously very much inspired by the older Daedalus class. You know it, you love it, we all do, the Daedalus. It's so charmingly clunky. But look how the nacelles are right up against the hull, and how what would be a saucer, which is a sphere, blends into a spherical, cylindrical, I should say, secondary hull. And everything's right up together. Kind of reminds me of the Taplana Hath type here, the angle. But even a little bit of connection with the Magee. Just a little bit. But I wanted to bring out something from TOS. Now again, an original series from the 60s, the only Federation ship we really ever get on screen is the Constitution. But luckily TOS remastered to give us some others. Muchly appreciated. They've been in canon 15 years now, so we'll count it. But our next one here, I'm surprised more people don't see the connection. I think this actually fits in perfectly. Ta-da! The Oberth. The nacelles are right up against the hull, which is square in the back, cylindrical in the front. And I maintain, and I think original design, this is not an engineering section. I've always thought this was a science pod, which solves the whole, well, the pylons are too thin for turbo lifts anyway. And the idea that there's decks here is just, it doesn't meet. Because this is a small ship. This is, and when people debate, but we're looking at 100 some odd meters, 150, 180, which actually fits really well with the Magee size and type here. In fact, I could see this being right in league. Now keep in mind the Oberth is not a new ship. In the 2380s, 2390s, it's an old design, at least relatively speaking. That's the thing I think people maybe forget. Just because we first see a ship, it can be an old ship or a new ship, you don't know. But I think this one here really fits, at least in the general concept. I don't mean the detailing like nacelles and stuff, but if you were just to pull off this secondary section, the pod here, what remains on top would look a heck of a lot like these two. So what do you think? And with that, let's move to the 24th century and some pretty darn obvious connections. Okay, as much as people don't talk about the Oberth being related, they do talk about the Defiant being related. Especially to the Engle-Class here. Okay, this isn't the Defiant as you know it. This is the concept of Valiant that came out early this year. Frankly, I just grabbed this because it was easier to get to. My Defiant's kind of in the back. Plus, my Defiant, the regular Defiant's been in so many videos, and this one hasn't, so, oh well, seemed fun. And this is a very flat design, even more than what we got on screen. But here we go, yeah, nacelles integrated with the saucer section, square in the back, deflector in the front. Yeah, this could easily pass for an older, less streamlined Defiant type hull. It actually kind of retroactively makes the Defiant look less out of place, because let's be honest, when the Defiant came in, it was an abnormal Federation ship, in a good way. Yep, Cisco's motherfucking pimp hand. That's Laura Reloaded's best contribution to the whole damn internet. Still cracks me up. And of course, the First Contact fleet also kind of has this design thing going on. Not unsurprisingly, the Saber is of the same idea. Again, blending the nacelles with the main hull. In fact, even a little more so than the Defiant because of how they hang out the back. Now, the Saber type was kind of a, not exactly concept Defiant, but the two designs, both in the real world and in the Star Trek universe, were related. This was seen as a bit more conventional in Starfleet, but still radically new, still radically flat, and kind of like the Magee, relatively small ship. This is not huge, only has a crew of a couple of hundred and just a few decks. The Saber's, I like the Saber. I wouldn't make a good hero ship, but it's an awesome little background ship. And that would continue with everyone's favorite, Steam Runner. Reminds me of an iron. Keeping the whole flat thing going, having the nacelles integrated in the front and then hanging out in the back, throwing the twist of having a secondary hull with deflector back here, also kind of keeping the how the hell do you get there vibe going on. Unlike with the Oberth, where I can excuse it as being a pod, this is very clearly a deflector, meaning people need to be around it, if nothing else, for maintenance. How do you get from here to here, here to here? Do you ride around the nacelles? It's big enough that you could probably go through the pylons. Yeah. So anyway, if this works, if this works, hey, at least you heard their metal. Then who are we to say that the Shran over here wouldn't work? I know this is definitely a love it and hate it ship itself, but I think it's been in canon so long that it's a staple now. Another good background ship. And these were worked on by John Eaves, as were the Discovery ships. So it's not just the people that direct Discovery that like the kind of flat design. That's kind of just how designs have been going in recent years. Recent years meaning the last 30 years. But in some ways, it is a little more realistic. It's also practical for combat situations. You know, being stretched up and down and every which way just makes you a bigger target, either for enemies or asteroids. So let's wrap this up. So what do I think of these? Well, the Magee, the Shran, I love the fact that it is named after Shran. It's interesting. It's I can't even say it's out of place in Discovery. It's too weird and different that it's almost timeless. I don't know. I know what they were going for, making something as compact as possible. There are certain situations for a ship that maybe needs to operate in an atmosphere more often. Or yeah, I can understand it. I just would like to know how they got around the nacelles. I'd almost like, instead of them being plunked literally in the middle of the saucer, maybe if they were just attached immediately above or below it, you know? So they can still connect it, just like have them above or below. I think that might have worked a little bit better. It's fine. What about the Engle? Frankly, I love it. I don't know. It's just different. It's very flat. It actually looks kind of old. This one, I wouldn't mistake for a first contact fleet ship. I may not immediately think of TOS era, but it looks older. It does not look 24th century to me. And I love the deflector sticking out the front. That's just the kind of clunkiness that you would want and need from a 23rd century ship. The only thing, the nacelles, them being flat, they may be a little too flat. Maybe more square. But other than that, no, I mean, this is one of my favorites, frankly. Just because it's different, but it still fits in. It hits most everything correctly. And I like the double connection for the nacelles. Something you'd expect from an older ship with the technology of the time. It works for me. It may not for you, but it will. And it may, yeah. And both of these are pretty similar in their construction. The tops are a single piece of metal with the nacelles being metal, and then the inserts being plastic, and then the bottoms, the kind of connective tissue on the bottom, that's plastic. The neat thing is the edges, as they come off the saucer, remain metal. Again, kind of with the plug on the bottom being the plastic part. So they both have weight, especially this one here, even though it's small. No, I'm really happy they did these. And I'm happy you hung out with me as I blow off some steam. So let me know what you think, either of these or the First Contact fleet, or heck, even that Medusan transport we looked at, because it's different, but I'm glad we have it. Well, with that, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe, all that good fun stuff. Until next time, this is Misha.